Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Trauma Camp for Teachers podcast. I'm your host, Julie Rose Polk, trauma therapist, trainer, and educator for all things trauma informed. In today's episode, we're talking about the why of the brain. So why humans do what we do. And understanding these drivers of human behavior are going to start to shift the way you understand what's happening, whether it's in your dynamics with your students, your colleagues, your administrators, or even in your personal life experience, in your personal relationships with family and friends and beloveds. Understanding these core motivators for human behavior is going to start to clarify a little bit about what's going on underneath the hood of the car, as I like to say. Over time, our brains have evolved to ensure our survival, and it does that through three primary duties. So duty number one, respond to threat. Duty number two, mate and reproduce. Hey. Duty number three, protect and nurture our offspring, right? So if we start to look through these three different lenses and how they might be driving any given interaction and human engagement, you start to understand how fundamental our feeling of survival is and how it plays out in our day-to-day experiences with others. So let's take a look at number one, responding to threat. If you're working with young children, they're primarily going to be oriented from this place of how do I keep myself fundamentally safe, right? That is their primary duty. They don't have offspring to nurture. They don't have anyone to mate and reproduce with. They are primarily focused on driver number one, which is how do I keep myself safe? And when we think about that idea of safety, a lot of us initially think of just physical safety, like how do I make sure that I am clothed, watered, fed, and sheltered and not experiencing violence. But it's important to know, and I'll talk about this in future episodes, the idea of safety spans way beyond physical safety. We're talking about emotional safety, mental, spiritual, psychological safety, environmental safety, communal safety. And so as we're looking at that through the lens of a younger child, we're trying to understand how is this child being motivated to create safety in their world, even if it doesn't make sense to us, even if it feels disruptive. How are they oriented to preserving their safety in any given moment? What are the tools they're using, whether they're adaptive or maladaptive? What's the approach they're taking? What is the strategy that they're employing? For young children, this is usually an unconscious strategy. Most kids aren't waking up in the morning thinking, how am I going to disrupt my teacher's day today? And so when we are experiencing some of their maladaptive coping tools that might disrupt our day, lead to meltdowns or arguments or outbursts, we have to start orienting to the lensing of how is this child trying to feel safe in my presence, in this classroom, in this group. So now let's move on to the second primary driver of human behavior, to mate and reproduce. In layman's terms, we're calling that finding love and connection, right? And so this is specifically to all of you middle school and high school teachers out there. You are seeing this on steroids. I honestly, when I think back to my adolescent years, I don't know how I took in any information. I was so preoccupied with who likes who and dating and feeling all the feels and the cascade of hormones. I honestly don't know how we learn it all, but alas, we do. That's your job. Congratulations, slow clap on that one. But when we look at understanding the human need, the human orientation to mate and reproduce as a way of securing ourselves in a trustable, reliable tribe, finding partnership, creating and continuing life, these are fundamental drivers of human behavior. And when we understand how high a priority that is, especially for the developing adolescent, it's really important that we create room and space for that to be present and alive inside our classrooms and in our relationships. So I actually want to take you back to my experience in high school, where my best friend was at a different school, so I didn't have my core person. And I was really involved. I had friends in different groups, and I was part of a lot of sports teams, and so I had those friends as well. But I was always kind of like at the periphery. I wasn't really of a group. I was around that group and could make friends, but it never was mine. And in my junior and senior years of high school, I actually started just showing up to my math teacher's class and doing homework, calling my best friend at her other school on her lunch break. But being in that room was where I would go for lunch every day. And I look back on it now. My math teacher was Judson Miller. Shout out Judson. Woo woo, I love you. I look back on it now and I can see myself through the lensing of what Judson probably saw me as, which was needing more belonging and more rootedness than I could achieve in the friend groups that were available to me. And that teacher really took me under his wing. There were a lot of students who would come. He made himself available to students at lunch to help with homework or studying for a test or whatever it was. So I wasn't the only one. He was a really good teacher. But he really allowed room for the building of relationships in his classroom and the building of different levels of bonding with him as a teacher between him and his students. And I took to that like a moth to a flame. I mean, I just soaked it in, and it was really beautiful, and he really made himself available in that way, which was finding a creative way to orient towards that need for, no, it wasn't mating and reproducing in this case, right? But the underbelly of that is really social belonging and finding your people. And he made space and room for that in our high school. And now let's move on to primary driver number 3, protecting and nurturing your dependents or offspring. And so this is all about protecting and preserving and nurturing and developing our kin, our tribes, our clans, our people, right? Whoever we call that, whether it's family, blood family, or chosen family. This is about protecting our own. And these are really core, fundamental survival strategies that humans employ on a daily basis. And the anecdote I want to share with you is actually when I was working, this is before I became a therapist, I was working at a private independent school in the Los Angeles area, and I was their admissions assistant. And so I was the face that everyone saw, hi Julia Rose, when people came in to apply, to tour the school, to come to our events as we marketed and promoted the school. I worked with parents as they were applying for their children to go to those schools. I still can't believe that children are applying to go to those young schools, but whatever, that's a different story for a different time. And I would also work very closely with parents as they were helping their kids apply to high schools. We were only preschool through 8th grade, so once middle school is completed, they were going off to high schools, and that's where a lot of the competitiveness set in. And I remember there was this one parent, there was a lot of chaos in her life. She was the only one kind of able to show up to that process. The other parent wasn't there. She was juggling so much, and there was so much pressure. This was one of the parents who you could tell that she was giving so much of her life and sacrificing so much of her life so that her child could have a better opportunity. And the stakes are really high when that's happening. And I remember one day she came into the office, and here I am ready to greet her. Hi, parent. And she comes in with this scowl, and it looks like there is steam coming out of her ears. She is livid, and she is basically ready to hang, draw, and quarter me. It's just like the look of death in her eyes. And she comes in and starts unleashing on me about the fact that certain transcripts hadn't made it to the school. Obviously, I wasn't a therapist at this time, but I'd been doing a lot of my own therapy, and I'd been working on my own boundaries. And I remember just pulling my chair back a little bit to create some space between us, because I was kind of feeling threatened in that moment by the level of anger and intensity of that experience. Not to mention that I was sitting down and she was standing up and kind of like hovering, not like over me, but like she was directed downwards at me. And so that created a physiological dynamic between us that felt really threatening to me. So I pulled back in my seat, and when she was done, I said, wow, you seem really angry. And just that reflection back to her, because I'll tell you, she may have been feeling angry, but she was also feeling something else. And so once I made this reflection back to her, she immediately paused and started crying and saying, "I'm so sorry, Julia Rose. I didn't mean to come at you like that. I am so afraid that my kids aren't going to get into these schools and that all of this will have been for nothing." And so when we understand that mom's behavior as here she is trying with all the tools she has to protect and nurture her dependent, it changes everything, right? We start to see that this isn't just a mom who woke up on the wrong side of the bed and chose to come pick a fight here. It starts to contextualize it into, oh, this is a mom's survival strategy. There is something so deep and fundamental inside her activated around this, and that really needs to be included in however I decide to respond to or approach this mother. And so these three primary drivers of human behavior: responding to threat, which is keeping ourselves safe; mating and reproducing, which is finding our love and connection and belonging; and protecting and nurturing our dependents or offspring, which is preserving and protecting and taking care of our kin, our fellows. Once we start to understand how present those are in each of our daily interactions, we actually can respond to the underlying motivation or the underlying need or the underlying fear, as opposed to just responding with what's at the surface, right? So in this case with the mom, it would have been completely appropriate for me to lead with, I need us to take a pause because I'm not going to be spoken to this way. And that would have been a totally appropriate boundary. But once that mom started crying and revealing this underlying thing that she was carrying in our interaction, all of a sudden that became less important, right? This wasn't a pattern with this mom. This wasn't how she and I typically engaged with each other. This was a once-off thing. And so the need for that particular response kind of dissolved in the moment. And we just made space for, this is all I'm carrying. This is the fear, this is the concern. This is the purpose that I'm carrying around this. And you know, I wasn't her therapist. I didn't do any more therapeutic approach other than listening to her and hearing her self-correct, accepting the apology she offered me upon coming to the awareness in herself that she was not speaking to me kindly. And so understanding these three motivations, it really has the power to shift and change how we interact with each other, the outcomes of those interactions. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it valuable. If you did, please go ahead and rate and leave a review on the podcast. I love to hear from you. This is why I'm doing this work. And so give me a thumbs up and let me know how I'm doing here with you. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.